good morning to everyone. My name is Richard Green. I am director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, and I would like to welcome you to this very special edition of Lusk Perspectives. I was trying to decide whether it's the 23rd or 24th webinar / podcast we have done since we started on March 22nd in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. What we have with us today is the leadership team for the Lusk Center, Chair Emile Haddad and Vice Chair Bill Witte. Emile is chairman of 5 Point Realty. Bill is chair of Related California. They have been with each of their companies since the beginning of those companies, and I think it would be a factual thing to say they are the largest mixed-use developers in California. 5 Point is well known for its development at the Great Park in Orange County. It is behind the Valencia development up near Newhall Ranch and the Candlestick Park redevelopment in San Francisco. Related California is doing the Grand Avenue project right now in downtown Los Angeles. And as it happens, I walked by it for the first time in a long time yesterday. And it's a lot more there than there was 4 or 5 months ago. As well as Related Santa Clara and other large projects. But beyond the fact that there are people doing something very difficult in a very difficult environment, they're two of the most thoughtful people you'll ever meet in real estate development space. Both are very well read, sort of thoughtful about the world environment, as well as their businesses. And so this conversation is going to be one that asks them for their views of the world, and of course how it relates to real estate in general and their projects in particular. And I want to start with the following question. So Bill and Emile and I had a pre-call maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and of course the world has changed considerably since we had that call, and as we noted before, we let you all in not for the better. I want to ask you both, when you first get up in the morning and thinking about your day, what are you most worried about at the moment? And let me start with Emile on that.
Well, I think I'm really worried about the fact that we have something in the United States that is going to be a challenge for us as it relates to navigating the waters of this pandemic. And that is that we have real democracy. And, this is what we're witnessing right now is the messiness of democracy. And I will not take anything but democracy, so please don't take this the wrong way. But at the same time, what we're seeing today is we're seeing our numbers and the way we're trending is really driven a lot by people's ability to say no to government. And, if you look at what happened in other parts of the world, there was a mandate and people followed it because they don't have the luxuries we have. So, if you're asking me about what worries me is that, we need to all understand that this is a moment of responsibility in a democratic system, which means there is a time for us to say, I have the right to choose whatever I want to do. And there's a time for us to say, I know I can, but I don't think it's in the interest of the larger society for me to not follow in line. I think that's one thing that concerns me, similar to you can't screen fire in a movie theater. That's one thing that is excluded from, Rise of Speed. And the other thing that Richard really concerns me right now is the divide that we have in this country with the political backdrop right now in the election, and how much of the managing the situation of the coronavirus is actually being political more than anything else.
I just want to push back a little bit on that before I turn it over to Bill, because Germany is democracy, and it's now a very robust one. And Japan is a democracy, and South Korea is a democracy, and yet people there have handled this much better. If you look at their numbers, and who knows, they may have a second wave. And I think one thing we've learned is never be content with where you are with COVID, because you never know when it could come back. But those are democratic societies, and they have managed this pretty well, at least relative to us, it would seem.
Well, I think that you have to differentiate. First of all, Germany and Japan have a long history of dealing with the crises that impacted the whole nation, whether it's wars or revolutions or a lot of things. So there's something in their DNA that understands that when you are facing a situation that impacts the whole country, there are certain things that you have to subordinate in terms of your democratic rights. We in this country have never had anything on our soil since the last part of the pandemic that actually impacted the country the way we're being impacted right now. And I think it's a behavioral issue. And two, yes, there are democracies, but we have in this country something that adds to that. And those are all the debates about constitutional rights. And those are debates that I think maybe because of the age of the other countries have been debated before. But today, I mean, look at the mask. The mask has become now the symbol of it's my constitutional right. You can't make me wear a mask. So I don't know if it's the age of our country or if it is the fact that we have never really gone through this. But I think that's probably what I would look at as the differentiator between us and Germany and Japan.
So Bill, let me turn it to you. What's worrying you when you first get up in the morning?
Well, at every level, both personally and professionally, there is an almost unprecedented level of uncertainty. That creates discomfort. It makes accomplishing anything difficult. It makes planning challenging. My wife likes to watch the news on TV. I can't watch it anymore, but I hear it in the background. I'm old enough to at least vaguely remember the Nixon years and the Vietnam War. And that's the closest parallel I can think of to what the country, as Emile said, is going through politically now. But I think this is far more concerning and worse. Also, the world is much less together than it ever was. In the old days, there was communism and there was not communism, and that wasn't necessarily healthy. Now, especially given the, shall we say, volatile leadership, certainly in this country and others, very difficult to think ahead and predict how we're going to get past this, even though I believe that we will. If you look at California, at the local level, sometimes even at the county level and at the state level, as Emile suggested, the polarization is so intense, it tends to suck all the air out of the room and make rational dialogue on issues of importance to all of us very difficult. In other words, you can't simply disagree, you have to disagree with increasing levels of rancor. We see it. I'm in Orange County right now, and in certain parts of the county here, there's a visceral opposition to wearing masks, notwithstanding the data and the cues from above. And different levels of government, even within the county, offer different requirements and information. I think everybody realizes all of those things. I've been around long enough to suggest that this is an unprecedented level of them.
Can I follow up on your point about the masks in Orange County? When people are polled on mask wearing, there is a supermajority in favor of it, and something like 3/4 of Americans say that they do wear a mask at least most of the time when they are out. And I can't believe Orange County is that different from the country in terms of its behavior, at least in terms of what how people say they behave. But the people who have been coming, the anti-maskers, I'll call them, have been extremely loud about it. And there was, in fact, a piece in the Orange County Register in the last couple of days about how at a hearing on masks, the head of whoever was having the hearing basically suppressed the pro-mask crowd and had of 20 people speak, 19 be anti-mask, while there were hundreds of written comments in support of masks. And so this is a broader point, I think, is it's not so much that the majority gets its way, it's that the loudest voices seem to have disproportionate impact.
So if you go to any city council meeting on a hotly contested real estate project, the loudest voices in the room will inevitably be the opponents. They may not be, often are not a majority, but they're the most resolved. They're the most committed. And I suspect that's what you're getting here. Now, Orange County also has something else not every place has. It has beaches and it's the summer. So I don't want to focus on Orange County, but it just goes to the larger question about polarization, that things have become so tribal.
So let me move from sort of the broad, what are the issues out in the world, to talking about how you're rethinking your business, if you're rethinking your business at all. I can't believe you're not, in light of the events of, we'll say, the past 4.5 months since we sort of went indoors in mid-March. How has it influenced, or has it influenced, the speed at which you're doing things, your marketing approaches? Or have you decided there are things you're not going to do? What are the tangible impacts of this? And I'll go in reverse order this time and ask Bill to go first on this.
Well, you know, it depends on what part of our business. We have an unusual business model in that we're a very large and active developer of affordable housing, as well as high-end urban and mixed-use developments. Starting in reverse, because it's the more challenging, in our two very large mixed-use projects on Grand Avenue and in Santa Clara, in the case of Grand Avenue, while under construction, and in Santa Clara about to start construction, we've had to rethink how much the components of our mix of uses, particularly on the retail side, how much we do. Grand Avenue has to be built all, is of course being built all at once, at least this phase. So you're having to make decisions midstream. Now, what we're not doing in either case is slowing down. You know, an option, albeit a challenging one, would be to say, let's just take the foot off the gas. But I think our view in general, in the business sense, is if you have the opportunity to certainly get things entitled and approved, of course, Grand Avenue is under construction, Santa Clara is entitled, you should do that. You always want to be prepared for when opportunity presents itself. We are also looking to the possible normalization of construction costs. Doesn't help us in Grand Avenue, it might in Santa Clara. But the biggest challenge...
Excuse me, Bill, why doesn't it help you in Grand Avenue?
Well, we're already under construction and largely bought out.
Okay, you're largely bought out. Okay, thank
you. In the larger market rate world, we are the most active residential developer in San Francisco right now. Just had a very large project approved this week, another in the works. But our strategy, which was already in place, was, given where we are at the end of a cycle pre-COVID, is not to have large land acquisition costs, but rather enter into deals that were options. So we didn't have to close on land. We didn't have to get too heavily financially committed. We also have opportunities we're working on in Santa Monica and Hollywood, where we're using that same approach, and it's working. And one thing that a crisis does is, in some quarters, it does inject some reality into landowners and joint venture partners. And the affordable side is very different. It's full speed ahead. There are some challenges, which I will talk about later. We've just won RFPs for affordable housing in Mountain View, Lake Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe, Oakland, and just outside Sacramento. So the interest in and need for affordable housing is probably greater than ever. There are a variety of challenges, again, which in implementing these and executing on these, which we can talk about later.
Just curious, so when you say a low-income housing, or affordable housing, is that all LIHTC stuff, or is it other kinds as well?
With the exception of our Sacramento area project, which is a so-called missing middle project, an area that we hope to exploit in the months and years ahead, They're all low-income housing tax credit projects.
Great.
We also have an office in Portland, and in a year and a half, we're on our 5th and 6th project. They're all affordable, all 100% affordable.
But
So
through
that
LIHTC.
business is busy, yes.
Through LIHTC. Got it. So Emile, how has this influenced how you're doing business?
Well, let me start by saying that it is very dangerous for people who are taking this moment in time to shift their thinking radically from what they were thinking about before and change the strategy while we're here and try to extrapolate from this, because this is a very unusual time. So, and I think from our perspective, Richard, you know me well enough to know that, at the foundation of what I do is a history of survival. I mean, that's the thing. So I mean, we were ready for a moment like this with a contingency plan. And the first thing you do in a crisis is to survive and survive with the least amount of damage possible. So when the day after comes, you don't end up having to dig yourself out of a deeper hole. So for us, survival meant something simple, which is within 24 hours, we implemented a contingency plan. It was all about liquidity and cash. We always were very low on debt, and now we don't have that. It's bonds that are matured 5 years from now. Those are the things that hurt you. And the next second thing you do once you protect yourself from a liquidity point of view is making sure that you're not going to be forced to sell assets at a discount and start from a point of asset devaluation that will take a long time to recover. And then you look at, your lines of defense. For us, it's that very simple. Our associates are our number one priority. And I say that, although a lot of CEOs will tell you it's their shareholders, but without our associates, the shareholders are not going to be, served. So for us, how do we make sure we come out of this as whole as possible? No layoffs, no furloughs, no loss of people, no loss of value. That was the first thing we did. The other thing we did was doing something that you and I and Bill and others have had a lot of discussions about, which is what's happening in the world that we live in right now in terms of disruption, and how is real estate going to look like in 10, 20 years? And I think what this period is doing is accelerating a lot of that. So you know that we've been very much focusing on the area of healthcare and partnering and collaborating with healthcare. And I've been saying for a long time that I think technology is going to disrupt healthcare next, and telemedicine and artificial intelligence is going to be a big factor in that. So what this is doing now is accelerating that, because people who are not comfortable with telemedicine are having to do it today. So from our perspective, what we're doing is saying, okay, well, we're going to survive this, we're going to come on the other side of this. How do we start implementing and accelerating? So we're working a lot on accelerating things that we wanted to see happen maybe over 5 or 10 years that are probably going to happen in a shorter period. And the last thing we're doing is acknowledging, finally, that the model of employment that came as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the factory, the 9 to 5, all of these silos of times and managing time is history. And I always say at 5 o'clock, every elevator in every office building is tapped. It can't be that everybody finished their work at 5 o'clock exactly. I see your cat, by the way. It's very cute. I was wondering what you were doing first, and then I realized what it was. So anyway, I think that we all have to start thinking about the model of employment that fits more the next revolution, the one that we've been living in, rather than the old one. This 9 to 5 is out the window. But that doesn't mean everybody's going to be working remotely because they want, because you can't build a culture through Zoom. So we're going to have to think about that, and we're doing a lot of thinking about that.
So I want to. So Bill touched on retail, and Emile, you basically just touched on office, and so I'd like to push on those two areas a little more. I know both of you have retail components in your development. Retail was troubled before COVID hit. I think one could argue that what COVID has done is accelerated the inevitable in retail. And so what is the role of retail within real estate development in the years going forward? What does it look like? So that would be one question. And this is sort of a beyond COVID, a broader question. And then Emile, your point about 9 to 5 being obsolete, and yet people need to be in the office sometimes because we need to interact with each other in order to get our work done. And Zoom doesn't always cut the mustard in that regard. How do you see office playing out? What does our office space look like in the future? Is it hotel space but with more distance between stations? How many days a week do people go into the office? How many days of the week do you need them to be in the office in order to get that culture building? So on the retailer office, I'll let either one of you go first, whoever would like, but if we could hear your thoughts about those two areas in greater depth, I know the audience would appreciate that.
Well, on the subject of retail, or I'll just say non-residential space in mixed-use developments, I think a point Emile made is worth noting. I'll give an example. We just opened a 550-unit, 40-story residential tower in the mid-market area of San Francisco. And it includes a significant and a historic component of the building, like 12,000 square foot, could be retail place. And we leased it to a company which was started, interestingly, by my niece, called TIA, which is about healthcare for women. And it's taken off for a variety of reasons. Now, that isn't where we would have been looking 6 months ago. And traditional players fell out as much because of COVID as because of changes in retail. So I think if you look at the history of quote unquote retail, it's always evolved over time. And there's always an opportunity to, if you stay ahead of the curve, to find an occupant of space. I think where you get in trouble is when you're so committed to, say, a movie theater at a time when the future of movie theaters may be more uncertain. So that's one comment. We are not primarily a retail developer. It's an amenity in large mixed-use projects, be it Grand Avenue or Santa Clara. And before COVID, food and beverage and entertainment had become the new retail. To some degree, if you look at demographics and consumer behavior, that is more a COVID phenomenon than a cycle or where we are in the retail world phenomenon. And I think the jury is out, not on whether there will still be demand there, but how quickly it will be able to be put back into play.
So I agree with Bill, and I would just maybe look at it also from a little bit of a different angle. First of all, whether it's retail or office, everything is going to be all dependent on the behavior of the consumer. So you really have to start looking at what people are interested in. And there's one thing that we're seeing right now, at least in this country, in that socialization is extremely critical for people. People are taking the risk of infecting themselves. People are taking the risk of infecting their elderly because they cannot get away from being social. And I think that you have to look at that as the behavior that's going to drive a lot of space going forward. So I believe that we are going to be living in time where socialization is going to be at the heart of everything we need to think about, and two, unique experiences that people are looking for. People are not going to be going for the boilerplate. So whether it's retail or whether it's office, I think that we need to be thinking of the space as a space that attracts people for a unique experience and for a place that becomes more of a social experience. We started seeing retail change from the old retail with Apple, where they moved the sales to the back and moved the experience to the front. And we started seeing retail become much more married to food and beverage and areas of experience, because it wasn't anymore where people wanted to go to buy something. It was going to go and have a unique experience and socialize. And oh, by the way, if they find something they like, they will buy. So we started seeing it already. And going back to my point, I think it's going to be acceleration. And I am willing to make a bold prediction that as we get out of this COVID-19, and as we start looking ahead, and this is going to be, unfortunately, a longer period and a more frustrating period than people think right now, I think we might actually be seeing a roaring 20s all over again. I think people, suppression is going to get them to be much more social. They're going to be more at wanting to be at the office because they would have been fed up of Zoom, and they're going to want to be back together. But they're not going to want to be back together in a 9 to 5, everybody goes into a cubicle. You have to think about your space as a space of people coming together to collaborate in one form or another.
I want to express a little skepticism to that view, but before I do, I do need to note that Emile's last bold prediction turned out to be exactly right, which was at our board meeting last March. He said, this is going to be really bad. And he talked about the fragility of the economy that ran as lean as our economy did and how that made us particularly vulnerable. So as I disagree with Emile, remember Emile was right. So what I'm about to say, it could be wrong. But the whole experience thing, so two things about the experience thing, and I'd like both of your reactions to this.
Well,
so first of all, I'm sorry, Bill.
Well, I just wanted to say that sometimes you have to dig in a little before making judgments on those points. For example, at least in our company, to Emile's point, the younger people for sure want to be able to go to the office. Absolutely. They miss it. They miss the social interaction. They miss the corporate culture development. It may be, and this was somewhat true anyway, that they don't feel they need to be there from 9 to 5 every day, that they can work remotely as they have been. But I think you have a bifurcation here, at least what we're seeing, is that younger people still feel that. I don't see any evidence that millennials, of which I have 3, are looking to move and end up to the suburbs at age 27. But by the same token, in the major urban areas, there's been an explosion of demand for high-end housing in the wealthy suburbs, in Napa, in Sonoma, in Marin County in Northern California, in Westchester County outside New York City. So there's a bit of a generational gap. Those who feel, well, you know, I don't really have to be in an office full time. And by the way, the cities are kind of shut down. I don't know how long that'll take. There clearly is a shifting of demand. Emile might have some comment on this from his own sites. I don't necessarily see that among first-time home buyers, where I think there are still challenges.
So, well, that was it. So the experience point. So a couple of things about that is, one is we can talk all we want about government shutting things down or not shutting it down, but at the end of the day, we know that people actually lead government on this stuff. So people were staying home, not everybody, but lots of people were staying home before Gavin Newsom told them to stay home. You had the NBA shut down before they were ordered to shut down. We're seeing it now, I think. We were taking a walk down Main Street in Santa Monica last night. And one of my favorite restaurants in Santa Monica is Chinois in Maine. And they now have this nice thing out in the street where you can eat, which Patty and I decided, well, we have to do that sometime soon. But what was striking to me is that there were lots of empty tables. And this was at like 7:30, 8 o'clock. So it was primed time to eat. And usually you can't get a table at that restaurant at 7:30 on a Wednesday night. And what that's telling me is people are still too afraid, and we actually have other evidence of this, to actually go out and do stuff. So that until I think we have a vaccine, it's hard for me to see how the experience thing is going to be a big driver of demand. That's the first thing. And the second thing, it's always been striking to me that for the provider of the real estate, experience is an expensive thing to do. It requires heavy tenant improvements that need to be amortized over a period of years that also might involve a tenant that doesn't survive over that length of time in order to repay those tenant improvements. Now, maybe the spillovers happen in a mixed-use context that you could sell the houses for more, or the office space becomes more valuable as a result of having those amenities. But is an F&B focused center a sustainable center financially in the long term?
So Bill, let me First of all, let me respond, make sure I clarify something. When I talked about the experience being at the heart of how we're going to have to think about things going forward, I was talking about it post-pandemic. As a matter of fact, I said that because I believe this pandemic is going to take longer and people are going to be much more frustrated with the situation of being separated and be at home, that's what's going to, I think, drive a lot of the anxiousness.
Okay.
So this is not today, and I agree with you. I mean, today, the people who are going and doing that are the people who either are in denial or they feel like they're, invincible. I lived through war, so I remember those days. I mean, there were always somebody sitting there, even though the bullets were flying, because they felt, okay, it's not going to hit me. So I think that that's key. The topic of sustainability of the F&B and retail. Today you have people who will stand in line in front of a Starbucks, pay a lot of money for a cup of coffee that I can't even pronounce the name of. And rather than having 5 cups of coffees, if they can afford it, they'll have 1. Today you have people who are looking for names of restaurants that only exist in one place and that had some unique thing about food. So I actually think for the right experience, people are willing to compromise quality for what they perceive as quantity. I think that, from my perspective, in order for us not to rely on others in the F&B and experience to be able to make sure that that amenity, as Bill mentioned, sustains, we're managing it ourselves. We're partnering with small people. Today, credit of a tenant doesn't mean anything to me. I'd much rather get, 100 small players in my space rather than rely on one that might go belly up tomorrow. And if out of the 100 small players, I create a very unique experience and 15% or 20% don't make it, I'm much better off than the whole concept of anchor.
So to that point, Richard, a couple of examples. When we started out Santa Clara 6 or 7 years ago, the presumption was there would be 2 department store anchors. The notion of a department store anchor is now obsolete almost anywhere. So that's a scale question. But even before COVID, we saw in the F&B space, restaurants moving to more casual, even the high-end restaurants, fewer white tablecloth type efforts, even the fancier food purveyors, opening fast casual places that could, even before COVID, accommodate a lot of takeout. So I don't see the demand for food and beverage being reduced. Obviously, the pandemic has to be brought under some control to change people's behavior, but the effective demand is there. The question is timing, and I think it will take a different shape. And to Emile's point, you will be lots more smaller players. You won't have as many large players, not just department stores, but other large users of space.
And are lenders willing to finance places that don't have credit tenants? Or do you get does this mean your sources of capital just have to be different from traditional capital sources?
Are you asking about financing the business or
No. It used to be when you'd underwrite so it used to be when a lender would underwrite a retail center, they would look at that's why all of our shopping malls became so boring, right? Is they all had the same tenants in them, because if basically you didn't have a line of credit as a tenant or rateable debt, you couldn't get, the developer couldn't get a loan refinanced or in place to build the shopping center in the first place. So you're both talking about that world is gone. You're talking about getting more niche tenants and getting diversification benefits from having a variety of tenants. But how do lenders look at that when they're underwriting?
So let me just maybe respond quickly. I think that what you just touched on means that a lot of the people who were, labeled as developers, who did all these shopping centers, were nothing but middle people who basically tied up the land and financed the project based on the credit of the tenant. And really, all they did is just simply secure the land and play. And we have a lot of people who played developer who you can't say this is the same mixed-use developer is related. I think that probably is going to be what's going to disappear. It's going to be the related of the world, the 5-point of the world, the Caruso of the world, the people who the bank will look at their track record and their credit rather than the tenant credit.
Yeah.
I would add to that again, we're sort of splitting hairs here, but as you see more move to smaller spaces, maybe not so much national chains, but I can give you examples, certainly in our buildings in San Francisco, of tenants, potential tenants who are creating niche products, but from credit tenants. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Now, as you get into the suburbs, maybe a little more challenging, and I'll give a perfect example. A friend of mine, some of you on the call may know of him, Shaheen Sadeghi, did something very unique in the 90s. He created in Costa Mesa 2 places called the Lab and the Camp, which could be in the East Village in Manhattan, except they're in Orange County. He has a few credit tenants, but the food and beverage people are all the type of niche players you were talking about. It takes initially a certain amount of equity, and it takes a discipline if someone's not making it to replace them with somebody else. So when you talk about how lenders view it, until COVID, where you had a unique product and enough equity, even a quote unquote smaller player was able to succeed because the rents per square foot would be very high. You could afford a certain amount of turnover. We're in a new world now. It's not clear, how people will react until this thing is brought under control.
So I want to start turning to the audience. And by the way, I should note that among the audience is the current installment of the Ross program in real estate, which is happening right now. And so we have 25 really fine students from that program on the call. And I'd like to read a comment from one of the members and then start getting into questions. The comment is from Cindy Hansen, who's currently in the Ross program, and it is on the issue of masks. And she just said she's from Taiwan. And she says the reason they're so compliant is simply because of SARS, and they understand how important it is to protect them. And so that gets to Emile's point, is when you have memory of a catastrophe, you know how important it is to avoid having it happen again. The other thing gets to, I think, Emile's civil liberties point is Cindy says that the government really enforces the quarantine with GPS tracking to make sure whoever's infected and foreigners who land in Taiwan stay at their locations for 14 days before starting any activities. And that's something I can't imagine Americans tolerating. It is that kind of, although the fact of the matter is Verizon or AT&T know where you are at every point anyway. So sort of the idea that we really are not being watched, I think, is a little.
Well, Richard, that's our biggest challenge right now, because in Germany or in other countries, they track you and they will know exactly where you were. And if you were in a part of the city that got infected, they will come take you from home and put you in quarantine for 14 days. You will have riots in the streets over here if we tell people we're going to track them and we're going to grab them from home and put them in quarantine because they were that's the challenge I was talking about.
Yeah. So, go ahead, Bill.
Richard, I don't know what different behavior will come out of this in that regard, but I would remind people that I think it was until 9/11, you didn't go through metal detectors at airports. I could be wrong on the timing, but all of a sudden, over the last 20 years, now there's metal detectors everywhere. We never had that before. So sometimes events like this trigger societal changes that then become, if not comfortable, somewhat routine.
But Bill, to your point, if you don't go through the metal detector, you don't get on a plane.
Right.
The law is simple. Here, we don't say to people, if you don't wear a mask, you can't get out of home.
Right.
So, people don't ride 65 or 75 miles on the freeway because of cultural change. They do it because if they drive over that, they're going to get a ticket. And I think until you start really putting some teeth behind the mandates, people will feel like it's a suggestion.
Well, by the way, given the resistance to exactly that type of regulation now, I'm wondering, Richard, maybe you remember, how did we ever pass national laws for seatbelts?
It came down to Congress decided that states would not get transportation assistance if they didn't have those laws.
Okay.
And so it was money.
Yeah.
And we did go from 55% of us wearing seatbelts to 85% of us wearing seatbelts. So it's a good point. Because Bill, you raised the issue of social change, I am going to bring up a question. And again, I'm sorry, I'm going to step on the cue from the audience, but I think this is an important one to talk about. Is if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, if you go back to before Charlottesville, there was net disapproval nationally of that movement. The most recent polling I've seen shows plus 20% approval for Black Lives Matter. How do you see the issues that are being raised as a result of George Floyd and BLM influencing real estate going forward?
Well,
I know I'm springing this one on you, but...
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think part of the change in polling is people were able to see for themselves firsthand exactly what happened rather than just reading about it. The second thing I would say is I think maybe it was nascent, but people looking at it, not just what they see on the news, but as Black Lives Matter, small b, small l, small m, rather than making a judgment about their perception, at least, of some organization. We've had a lot of internal discussion in our company. I've kept it internal. We've long had at least some reminder. We have active partnerships on affordable housing developments we've developed with 9 different African-American churches, including the largest such in LA and Oakland. So it's not a new topic for us. I think what I would say, though, that we've had the most reflection on internally is how little involvement, not only in the market rate real estate world, but even in the affordable housing world, there is of people of color, particularly Latino and African American. There's a complete disconnect, not intentional, between populations being served and the people in the real estate world who are serving them. It's not bad faith. It's something that's, I will just say, has generated a lot of, the Ross program, USC in and of itself, by its relative uniqueness, is a comment on that.
So, Bill, Richard, you know how much that topic is near and dear to my heart, not the BLM as much as the whole issue of inequity that is now even highlighted more with the COVID-19. And that's why, we support Ross, and that's why we started the whole program of sustainable society. Because I go back to what lessons can we learn from the last revolution, the last 100 years, that we want to make sure we don't repeat going forward. And one of the things that we did is we abandoned the inner cities because they were not attractive to live during the factory era. And those who had the ability, mainly whites, went to suburbia and created suburbia. And the more we moved the benefits to suburbia, the more we left the inner cities to rot. Public education, all the issues that came. And then, we have now a huge inequity that exists. I hope that when people talk about Black Lives Matter or any Lives Matter, but Black Lives Matter is not only about meaning life and death, meaning Black Lives Matter. Let's make sure we bring back equity, education. Let's bring back things, because life is not about, am I dead or am I alive? This is all a movement out of an unfortunate situation where we saw somebody being, killed in essence. But I want to go beyond that. I want to talk about life, meaning we need to go back and redevelop the inner cities. We need to build back education like we're doing at USC in the inner cities. We need to provide job training. We need to be able to go back and lift people up so we can bridge the gap that exists today in society. And that's, I think, what we've been focusing on, as you know, and that's, I'm hoping, is what we're going to tell you. I tell you, being on the task force of the governor, probably the number one issue that has been highlighted more than any is the inequity issue, the digital divide issue, the fact that kids who are learning at school today are not getting the same education because some people have access to technology, some people don't. Those are issues that I think are going to accelerate, hopefully, the focus on fixing things that we need to fix.
So actually, Emile, if you could tell us, excuse me, Emile, if you could tell us a little bit about that task force, because the audience may not be familiar with it, and then Bill, I'll turn it back over to you.
So, I mean, the governor, you know, a couple of months ago, or maybe more, announced a task force for the recovery of the economy and jobs. And really, the task force is mainly focused on how do we get the economy going while we are keeping an eye on health, and short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And it has some big names. I mean, I don't know how I ended up on it, but you have people like Rick Caruso on it, like Bob Iger, and like Tim Cook and others, and Janet Yellen. So he put together a group of people from business, from environmental, from labor, and teamed them with some of the government. And then we created committees where every one of the committees is focused on something. So I co-chair the Capital Market and Infrastructure Committee, where our focus is all on infrastructure, short-term and mid-term and long-term for job creation, and hoping that maybe this is a moment in time that allows us to do something we did back during the Great Depression. Not that I'm predicting Great Depression, when we built a lot of infrastructure to create jobs, and that's what enabled the country to really propel very quickly. So, you know, we meet every other week as a task force on Zoom with the governor and the whole task force, and we have meetings, 2 meetings every other week with the infrastructure committee. So we'll see. I mean, it's still new, as you can imagine. Everybody's drinking from a fire hydrant right now, and a lot of it is focused on health, and there's a lot of opinions on it.
Well, Richard, I was going to say, you asked how that we might see that in our businesses. I think one thing we're already seeing, I'll give you some examples. Our recent high-rise approval in San Francisco was part of a rezoning of a mid-market area at Van Ness Avenue and Market Street called the Hub. It includes 3 towers. There are ultimately 15 other sites. The Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors approval was conditioned on the Planning Department undertaking with some specified community organizations the study of the social and equity impacts of this, and how not so much it could be mitigated, but to Emile's point, of how it can be improved. We're seeing that in the Crenshaw district in LA right now. I wouldn't say sudden at all, but more of a focus on gentrification, and not whether it's good or bad, but how can we improve the lives of those who've stayed behind, who didn't move to the Inland Empire, for example. I think you're going to see that certainly in the urban areas continuing for some time, and appropriately so.
Let's move to the top. We have about 9 minutes left, and there's a question from Scarlett Gia, who's again part of the Ross Group this year, about affordable housing. And her questions are quite specific, but since we don't have a lot of time left, I'd just sort of like to get a sense from you, because both of you work on affordable housing, both of you care a lot about the problem that it creates for us here in California, both from a social justice and an economic perspective. What about the system right now is most broken? If you could fix one thing so that we would have more of it, what would that thing be? And let me start with Bill on this one.
Well, it's almost too easy to say. There is no one thing. You know, affordable housing is viewed as a resource issue often. We need more subsidies, and that's true. But I view it more within the context of land use, that it's really not just about affordable housing. What's broken somewhat in California is conflicting, inconsistent, obsolete regulations on land use. Challenges, of course, a state this large and complex. It's hard to have one statewide standard. But until and unless there is a more, let's just look at it regionally, I would say even on a county-wide basis, more regional planning, the ability to financially, politically, and otherwise create more affordable housing will always be constrained. There's a lot of resources there now, if not sufficient. It takes too long. So you'll hear data on how much units and dollars and all this. But if you look at the annual delivery, especially in coastal California, it's not what it needs to be, and that's a large part of the reason.
So, Richard, I look at it this way. Affordable housing so far has been nothing more than a mitigation. It is separated from the need for housing. It is a compliance issue. If you're going to build this project, you will have to build 10% affordable. And a lot of people used to look at it as a negative and put it in a corner and all that. And we tend to look at affordable housing really more in the context of housing. And I think that if you stop thinking about affordable housing as mitigation and think about housing as a broad-based opportunity that you give for a very diversified community, then you start thinking about affordable housing not as mitigation. I think that the biggest challenge you have in housing, now that I put affordable housing in housing, is local governments objecting to or not allowing housing to happen because, you know, board of supervisors and council members don't get elected because they approve projects because of a lot of historical movements. I think that if the state were to create the right incentives and a stick and a carrot with the local government to say, you have to produce, I mean, we have the RENA numbers that came out, which is the shortage of housing that we have in California. And it has been allocated to cities. If you go to a city and say, City X, your requirement is to build 30,000 homes. And if you are going to build 30,000 homes, you are going to have X percentage of that to fit within a certain price, because it's not only affordable housing, it's also workforce housing. We have a lot of teachers and police and fire that serve in one community, but they can't live in there. And if you create an incentive, the state has a density bonus program, which basically is simple. It says, if you're willing to take your affordable housing and push it all to be very low income, you get a certain density bonus for market rate. Those are programs that are incentive programs. If you create an incentive for a developer, an incentive for a city to provide housing, and take the mindset of affordable housing as a mitigation, but as a social need, I think we start shifting the way we think about affordable housing.
So we're at 11:55, and I know we have to let Bill go right at noon. So I want to finish off with a broad question, and I'm sorry to those of you whose questions I didn't get to today. But it's about the future of California. So during COVID, post-COVID, are you a bull on California, a bear on California? Before all of this, we had lots of people moving to Phoenix, lots of people moving to Las Vegas. What do you see the evolution of the state? Are you a buyer? Clearly you're a buyer because you're both developers here, but what is your outlook for us as a state?
I can start if you want, or Bill can start. I have always been and will always be extremely bullish on California. We bet the farm in California. We're the company that has basically tied its future to California. We don't build anywhere else. We're just a California developer. And that's because if you go back, that everything that has changed the way the world lived came from the state mainly. Whether it's the movie industry, whether it's the internet, whether it's the .com, whether it's all the things that are happening. And this is a place that will always be a place of innovation. And it will always be debated. I have been hearing about the demise of California since I came to this country 34 plus years ago. But what we really were talking about is there are certain people who are going to fit within an old economy as the state leads a new economy that will find it difficult to live in the state, either because of, taxes, price, cost, whatever it is, or because the jobs are not here. So if you're asking me, I am extremely bullish, and if anything, I'm even more bullish, because what this pandemic is going to do is going to create many more think tanks who are going to think about how do we make sure that we don't get into this situation in the future, and think tanks cluster together. Silicon Valley is the first example of a city of the future, and it was not built by government. It was built by people who just simply wanted to cluster together to create a bigger think tank, and look what it did to the world. So I'm extremely bullish.
Bill?
I would echo that. I think we shouldn't be in our businesses if we don't believe that. I do think, touching on something Emile said, that a lot of the innovation of the future that will continue to support a strong California is going to come more from the private sector than from government for a whole lot of reasons. We're already seeing that. Obviously, times like this test the ability of the state. I will leave you with this anecdote. I came to San Francisco in 1981 to work for Dianne Feinstein in housing as mayor. There's an article someone recently sent me, April of 1981, and it starts out reading about high housing costs and displacement. If you didn't know the date, you could have thought the article was written last year, but that was 40 years ago. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, but to Emile's point, people have been predicting the demise of California for similar reasons for many, many years. And a combination of innovation, dynamism, frankly, immigration, I might add, have buoyed it, and I think will continue to. There's going to be ups and downs, but I'm bullish.
So Bill Witte from Related California, Emile Haddad from 5 Point, both of you from the Lusk Center for Real Estate, thanks so much for spending an hour with us this morning and for your insightful comments. Our next Lusk Perspectives will be led by the very capable Mary Lynn Bourne, my wonderful colleague. I will be missing for the first time as I'll be on vacation next week. So thank you all very much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.